June, honey, I got a song I wrote just especially for you. I want to sing for just for you.
What is it?
It's called Hey Good Looking.
Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I invite you into a corner of country music history that most have chosen to forget or pretend never existed. Behind the legend, the voice that gave us "I'm so lonesome I could cry" and "Your cheatin' heart" was a man battling demons far darker than any heartbreak he ever sang about. Hank Williams wasn't just a star. He was a storm, raw, brilliant, and dangerously unfiltered. He lit up the Grand Ole Opry, only to be cast out of it. He wrote the songs that defined a genre, even as he spiraled into the kind of self-destruction no one dared speak of. But few know this. Before he died, at just 29 years old, Hank is said to have written a list of 5 musicians he deeply resented. Not just artistic rivals, not just industry politics, but 5 men he reportedly loathed so much he refused to ever share a stage with them again. Is it rumor? Is it real? Or is it something in between, whispered only by those who truly knew him? Tonight, we opened that page, if it ever existed, and ask, what does it mean when a man with a voice from heaven names his devils on earth? Hiram Hank Williams was born in Mount Olive, Alabama, in 1923. And from the very beginning, it was clear this boy was different. Frail in body, but sharp in spirit, Hank was no stranger to pain. He was born with spina bifida occulta, a condition that would cause him lifelong agony. But instead of breaking him, the pain gave him something most musicians spend decades trying to find: authenticity. By his teenage years, he was performing on street corners, drawing crowds not with theatrics, but with something far more powerful: raw, naked emotion. When Hank sang, people listened, not because he was polished, but because he was honest. His voice cracked, his rhythm swayed, but there was truth in every note, and that truth cut deep. In the late 1940s, as post-war America searched for something real, Hank emerged like a thunderclap. His songs were poetry for the broken, ballads for the betrayed. Lovesick Blues didn't just make him a star, it shook Nashville to its core. He wasn't just another singer, he was a movement, a man who made pain sound beautiful and heartbreak feel holy. By 1951, Hank Williams was a household name. He had more than 30 hit records, a spot on the Grand Ole Opry, and the kind of fame that most country singers could only dream of. But fame, as always, is a double-edged sword. While the world fell in love with Hank Williams, Hank was slowly falling apart. He drank too much, fought too often, and trusted too few. His marriage to Audrey Shepherd, his manager, duet partner, and muse, was as passionate as it was poisonous. The two fought brutally, both in private and in public, and Hank, already battling chronic pain, turned increasingly to alcohol and morphine. The smiling cowboy in rhinestones was more often than not a man in agony. Still, the public adored him. He was the voice of their heartbreak, the soundtrack to their sorrows. He sang of cheating hearts and lonesome nights, of cold, cold truths that others were too afraid to admit. And they believed in him, not just as a singer, but as something more, a prophet of pain, a poet of the South. But behind the curtain, Hank Williams was burning. And as his pain grew, so did his list of enemies. He felt betrayed by the industry that once embraced him, discarded by the institutions he helped define. The Grand Ole Opry dismissed him. Friends distanced themselves. Promoters canceled shows. And yet he kept writing, kept singing, kept clawing at the only salvation he had ever known: music. Hank Williams died on January 1st, 1953, slumped in the back seat of a Cadillac somewhere on the road between Knoxville and Canton. He was just 29 years old. But in less than a decade, he had written more than 150 songs, changed the course of country music, and carved his name into the soul of America. The man was gone, but the mystery remained. And among those whispered mysteries was that list. 5 names, 5 men, 5 wounds never healed. Ladies and gentlemen, behind every success story in Nashville, there's a trail of bruised egos and burned bridges. And for Hank Williams, those scars were not just professional, they were personal. For a man who sang with such aching vulnerability, Hank could also be cutting, vindictive, and unforgiving. He didn't just keep receipts, he wrote them into his songs, etched them into backstage arguments, and perhaps into that rumored list of 5 men he swore he'd never forgive. The first name often whispered in connection with this list is Roy Acuff. To the world, Roy was the king of country music, but to Hank, he was once a god who turned into a gatekeeper. Acuff had inspired Hank in his youth, but as Hank rose to fame, their dynamic shifted. Roy, a traditionalist and a figure of authority at the Grand Ole Opry, allegedly clashed with Hank over his erratic behavior. Hank, meanwhile, resented what he saw as condescension. According to one road manager, Hank once muttered backstage, "Roy thinks he owns country music, but he sure as hell don't own me." Whether it was envy or rebellion, something deep cracked between them. The second man, Eddie Arnold. Smooth, clean-cut, and radio-friendly, Eddie was everything Hank was not. While Hank wrestled demons on stage, Eddie glided through the airwaves with a polished smile and velvet voice. Nashville adored Eddie. Hank did not. To Hank, Arnold represented the corporate sanitization of country, stripped of grit, soul, and truth. It's said that during a heated exchange at a studio appearance, Hank barked, "You ain't country, you're a damn lounge singer in a cowboy hat." The divide wasn't just about style, it was about identity. Hank saw himself as the voice of the broken-hearted. He believed Eddie was just pretending.
Then came Jim Denny, the third name, perhaps the most consequential of all. Denny was the talent manager at the Grand Ole Opry, and in 1952 he made a decision that shattered Hank. He fired him. Officially, the reason was missed appearances and unreliability, but to Hank it was betrayal. The Opry had been his temple, and Jim Denny had thrown him out like a sinner. Friends say Hank never forgave him. He called him a man who wouldn't know music if it bit him in the ass. Some believed the hurt from that dismissal never left him and may have hastened his decline. The fourth figure is less talked about, but no less volatile. Tex Ritter, the singing cowboy and movie star, was beloved by Hollywood and the country elite alike. But Hank found him shallow. He allegedly told a friend, "Tex don't sing from his heart, he sings from a script." On one occasion, when a promoter tried to put them on the same bill, Hank flatly refused. "Let him ride his horse into the studio and shoot his 6 guns," he said. "That ain't country music, that's theater." And then there's Spade Cooley, fiddler, band leader, and at one time a household name. But beneath the fame was darkness. In 1961, Cooley would be convicted of murdering his wife. But even before the crime, Hank distrusted him. There were whispers of abuse, of ego run amok. Hank reportedly told a booking agent, "I won't share a stage with a man who beats a woman. I don't care how many fiddles he plays." These names, ladies and gentlemen, weren't just rivals. They were reflections of everything Hank feared: conformity, betrayal, phoniness, and cruelty. Whether he actually wrote their names down or not, Hank carried them like splinters beneath his skin. And as his life unraveled, the bitterness only deepened. Ladies and gentlemen, by the time 1952 arrived, Hank Williams was no longer the golden boy of country music. He was a man unraveling, publicly, painfully, and permanently. The whispers had turned into headlines. The missed shows became routine. And Nashville, the town he once electrified, began to close its doors one by one. The most brutal blow came from the place he loved the most, the Grand Ole Opry. For Hank, the Opry wasn't just a stage, it was validation, it was home. But on August 11th, 1952, after too many absences and one too many drunken appearances, the Opry let him go. The decision, signed off by Jim Denny, wasn't taken lightly, but it cut Hank to his core. Friends say he didn't rage, he didn't scream, he just stared at the letter in silence and whispered, "That's it then." But later that night, drunk and seething, he wrote a note that would resurface years later in a box of personal belongings. "I gave them songs they'll sing for 100 years, and they couldn't give me one more chance." He wasn't wrong. His songs did last, but his bitterness did too. From that moment on, something shifted in Hank. The fire that once burned to create now turned inward into a kind of emotional arson. He began to lash out at promoters, at interviewers, even at fans. During a live radio interview in Shreveport, when asked about his former Opry colleagues, Hank replied, "They smile for the camera and stab you backstage. I don't call that family, I call it a circus." The man who once captivated America with his sincerity now couldn't hide his resentment. He performed with more venom, sometimes changing lyrics mid-song to take shots at people only he and his band understood. And yet, even in that spiral, he kept writing. The pain didn't silence him, it sharpened him. Songs like "I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive" and "Your Cheatin' Heart" weren't just hits. They were warnings, prophecies, cries from the inside of a man who no longer believed he belonged anywhere. Backstage, tensions boiled. In one infamous incident in Montgomery, a fellow artist, rumored to be on that infamous list, tried to shake Hank's hand before a show. Hank reportedly pulled back and said, "You sing like you've never been hurt. That's why nobody believes you." The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room felt it. Hank wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. Audrey, his ex-wife, would later say in a private conversation to a friend, he hated the men who reminded him of everything he couldn't be. Disciplined, clean, accepted. And perhaps that's the key. Perhaps the list wasn't really about hatred at all. Perhaps it was about shame, envy, isolation. Because the deeper Hank fell, the more he seemed to see enemies everywhere. He grew paranoid, suspicious. He believed the industry wanted to replace him, erase him, polish him out of existence. Let 'em try, but they'll never write it like I do, 'cause they ain't bled for it. The stage was still there. The crowd still came, but the man was slipping away. And beneath every performance, beneath every lyric, There throbbed the pulse of a man betrayed by the very world he once ruled. And so the list, whether it was real, metaphorical, or just a ghost of Hank's pain, grew louder in his mind. 5 names, 5 scars, and no apology in sight. Ladies and gentlemen, in the final weeks of Hank Williams, he was a man out of time, wandering between small towns, second-rate venues, and the haunting knowledge that his greatest days were already behind him. He was booked for shows he never made, cheered by fans who didn't know he was fading right in front of them. And all the while, that list, real or imagined, lingered in his heart, like a wound that refused to heal. But something happened near the end, something strange. Witnesses say Hank began to soften ever so slightly. He started to mention names from the past, not with venom, but with a distant sorrow. In one of his last conversations with his steel guitarist Don Helms, he reportedly said, "I don't hate them, you know. I just wish they'd seen the boy, not just the show."
It wasn't an apology, but it was close. He carried that pain with him on December 30th, 1952, as he climbed into the back seat of a baby blue Cadillac in Knoxville. The weather was icy. His driver was a college kid named Charles Carr. Hank was slumped under a blanket, a bottle of morphine nearby, his guitar case unopened beside him. He never made it to the new year. When they found him, sometime after midnight on January 1st, 1953, Hank was gone. 29 years old, 3 marriages worth of heartbreak, dozens of songs that would become immortal, and one story that would outlive them all. Among his scattered belongings, his hat, a few bills, a notepad, there was no official list, no crumpled paper naming the 5 men he'd despised. But Don Helms later claimed he once saw Hank scribble a few names in a moment of rage and then tear it to pieces. He didn't want to leave this world holding a grudge, Don said, but I think the grudge had already taken something from him he couldn't get back. Perhaps that's the real heartbreak. Not that Hank Williams hated anyone, but that he loved too much, hurt too deeply, and died still waiting for someone, anyone, to understand the difference. Ladies and gentlemen, he sang about cheatin', drinkin', cryin', and prayin', but he never sang about forgiveness. Maybe because he never found it. Not from others, not from himself. And in the end, maybe that's the only name that ever mattered on that list. His own. Ladies and gentlemen, as we close this story, we're left not with judgment, but with questions. Deep, uncomfortable questions that linger long after the music fades. What do we do with pain that never finds peace? With grudges that outlive the men who held them? And with legends whose greatest enemy might have been the mirror? Was Hank Williams angry because others wronged him? Or because he couldn't find a way to forgive them? Was the list he carried a reflection of betrayal or a reflection of himself? There are no easy answers. Fame is a strange kind of curse. It magnifies talent, yes, but it also magnifies every flaw, every wound, every whispered slight. And for Hank, those whispers became roars. He gave the world his soul in song, but felt it gave him back silence when he needed understanding the most. So tonight, I ask you, is it possible to be a genius and still feel invisible? Is it possible to be adored by millions
and still hate what you see in the eyes of your peers. Perhaps that's the true story behind the so-called list. Not a record of enemies, but a diary of disappointment. Ladies and gentlemen, behind every curtain call, there's a man packing up his guitar, nursing his wounds, and wondering if the spotlight was ever really worth it. Hank Williams left us with melodies that still echo through time. But he also left behind a silence filled with names, regrets, and a question that country music still hasn't answered. Can you sing your pain to the world and still die unheard? Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, may we all learn to listen a little closer.